Hey everybody, welcome back to 6 Minute Salesforce. I'm RJ from Debug, and today we're going to be talking about networking in the developer console again, looking at Chrome's developer console specifically, and we're going to be talking even more specifically about the Apex remoting or Visualforce remoting that kind of comes along with that, and what protections that provides us with inside of the network console here. So we're going to go back to our networking test, and we are going to open our network console. And we're going to leave this here for a second, and we're going to go look at some code real quick so you guys can understand exactly what I'm talking about here. So right here we have the networking test remote, and this is just a class, an Apex class here. And we've used this little guy, this little annotation right here, to denote that this is in fact a remote action, and it is you can call it via the remote actions. And so when this compiles and everything gets loaded in, this gets stored in a remote actions. Essentially, you can call it from the remote actions, right? So it gets its own little section of remote actions. So we've named this guy, you're going to have to remember this. Networking test remote is the class, and then perform remote call to API is the method that we're using. And we can see here, we're still using all the same endpoints, the same methods. So it's this API that I made in PHP. We're still using get. And what we're going to do is, this is kind of like a sneaky way of doing this, but when you take it back out, you deserialize this response to a map of string and objects. And so that's kind of the cheap way of getting around it. The real way you'd want to do this is to build an entire class that maps this exact object, so you know what kind of object you're getting back from your API, and then you build out a nice class that'll just take that and you deserialize that the normal way with that class type. But today we're going to use the cheap way because we're not really worried too much about those details. We'll get into that in another lesson. So here's what we're doing right here. We're making a HTTP request, a brand new one. We're going to use this as the endpoint. We're going to use this as the method. Then we're going to make new HTTP, and that HTTP is going to send that HTTP request. And it's going to capture, or it's going to respond with a response, very obviously. But we're going to capture that response here. We're going to save it into its little variable res. And then we're going to take that and we're going to get the body of that response and deserialize it into a map of string object. And just real quick, if you guys don't know what a map is, it's basically just a key value store. So the string is the key, the object is the value, and that's it. So every key that you have is unique, and every value is attached to that key, basically. So anyway, we've got this guy, and we're going to go back even further to our actual Visualforce page, our networking test page, right? We're going to look at this. So we're going to set a timeout here, a remoting timeout of 120,000, and we got to remember this is in milliseconds. So set ourselves a note here. That's in milliseconds. Then we're going to have a response object, and we'll see down here real quick, if we go all the way to the bottom, what we're going to call is perform Apex remoting call. In here, that's the JavaScript guy that comes over here to this guy, and this is what it calls. And inside of here, we have the Visualforce remoting manager, and it's going to invoke this action. And like I said, remember before I was saying that this networking test remote class is out there, and it's got a remote action annotation on the perform remote call to API method, and that gets stored in this remote action thing, or this bigger remote action, I guess, object, if you want to call it that. But that's how we're going to attack it. So we're going to say remote action dot, then your class name, and our class name was networking test remote dot your method. And our method was called perform remote call to API. And again, we can go look at that, and you can see, sure enough, networking test remote is our class, and perform remote call to API is our method. So that is the first parameter of the invoke action method. The second parameter is a function, and you can make this an anonymous function, and we'll go over that again in another lesson. Or you can build out another function here, which I've done, and it takes in a result and an event, and basically the whole entire thing that happens is it calls this guy. This is our callback. It's going to call this guy as soon as it's done making that perform remote call to API, and it's going to figure out all that we need to do here. So it's going to take the result, right? And it's going to deep copy. Don't worry about that. That's just a little trick I learned in the JavaScript world. And then it's going to insert that string into the text area, right? So now let's see how this works. We've got our networking test. We're going to look at the network requests that go out now. So same thing. We're all set up. Now look at that. We see this Apex remote, and we see a good bit of stuff in here, right? It called networking test remote. It was just the action. The method is perform remote call to API, and the result is here. But look at that. We don't see a lot of other stuff here. We only see the result. We're not seeing anything else that was sent out. So now you're kind of abstracting some of this stuff away from the user's vision. They can't see this stuff anymore. This is outside of their scope, essentially, as a person. So we don't know what necessarily got sent. We just know what came back because it made an Apex remoting call with some stuff, and that was hidden behind the scenes from the user. And then it came back with something, and the page was responsible for that. So this Apex remote piece that came back was actually, once that remote call finished, that's what came back to us in that response. So now we can see all the same stuff here that we got last time, all the same results as last time, but we've lessened our security risks here. So if we have anything that we don't want the user to see that's going to be made in a networking call, this is how we would go about doing that. So maybe a username that gets sent out, or pretty much any sensitive information that you want to hide from the user. Maybe you have a key, an API key that you're using behind the scenes that you don't want the user to see, because then they can take that API key and make their own API calls against your API key and have maybe unlimited access to some paid resource. Or maybe your key has a certain number of tokens associated with it, and if somebody gets that key, they can use up all of your tokens. So when you want to hide stuff from the user, this is the way to go about it. This is the way that Salesforce, I believe, recommends that you do HTTP calls if you're going to do them from a JavaScript page. Sorry we ran a bit long, but that's pretty much it. And I'll see you guys next time on 6 Minute Salesforce.